She gave Henry VIII a daughter, a new religion, and a crown reshaped by love. But in just 3 years, Anne Boleyn went from queen to condemned. On a cold morning in May 1536, she stood alone on a scaffold, abandoned by the man who once defied a pope to marry her. This is the haunting truth behind her fall, how power, politics, and betrayal led to one of history's most elegant executions. And if you crave true royal stories that grip you till the end, don't forget to join us by hitting subscribe. Anne Boleyn wasn't born to be queen. She was clever, ambitious, and bold, everything a Tudor woman wasn't supposed to be. But she captured the king's heart like no one before her. Henry VIII waited years, broke from Rome, and tore England from the Catholic Church just to have her. She was crowned queen in 1533, carried high above a sea of whispers. But in that very moment of triumph, the seeds of her destruction were already being sown by jealous nobles, betrayed allies, and a king whose love turned cold when no son arrived. By early 1536, Anne's position at court had grown fragile. She had given birth to Princess Elizabeth, but 2 pregnancies after that had ended in loss, most recently a son. Henry, once obsessed with her, had begun avoiding her chambers. He no longer saw a queen, he saw a disappointment. And while Anne still argued boldly in court, her enemies sharpened their smiles. Jane Seymour, her quiet and calculating lady-in-waiting, had caught the king's wandering eye. And in Tudor England, a queen without a son was just a guest waiting to be replaced. Behind the throne, silent daggers were drawn. Thomas Cromwell, once Anne's political ally, had turned against her. They clashed over religion, foreign alliances, and power. Now, Cromwell sought her downfall, not with swords, but with whispers. He began building a web of accusations: treason, adultery, even incest. Most were built on nothing, fragments of court gossip twisted into something darker. But in Henry's court, truth didn't matter. Appearances did. And the king, hungry for a male heir and already drawn to Jane Seymour, didn't resist the lies. He welcomed them. On May 2nd, 1536, and was summoned while watching a tennis match. A messenger approached quietly. The king had ordered her to the tower. She stood, stunned, but did not protest. No crowds jeered. No trumpets blared. Just the soft sound of footsteps and fear. She entered the tower through the same gate where she once arrived as queen. Now, she returned as a prisoner. That night, she slept in the same room where she had prepared for her coronation. Except this time, the only crown she awaited was made of fate and wasn't taken down alone. 5 men were arrested with her, each accused of treasonous intimacy. Among them were her brother, George Boleyn, and court musicians, poets, and nobles. The charges were shocking: secret affairs, forbidden meetings, even conspiring against the king. But the evidence was flimsy. Some dates were impossible, places didn't align. It didn't matter. Trials were rushed, testimonies coerced, and no defense stood a chance. The outcome had already been chosen. This wasn't justice. It was removal, disguised as law. On May 15th, 1536, and stood before a jury of noblemen, many of whom owed their titles to the king. Dressed in a deep black gown, she held her head high as the charges were read aloud: adultery, conspiracy, betrayal. She denied every accusation with calm and dignity. But her words fell into a courtroom already poisoned. George Boleyn, her brother, was tried the same day. He too denied all charges, but both were found guilty. The sentence was death, and as Anne was led back to her cell, she finally asked, "Where is my accuser?" Knowing the answer too. Well, in her cell at the tower, and waited. Her ladies-in-waiting, assigned by the king, watched her closely, not to comfort her, but to report every word she spoke. She prayed aloud, sang softly, and sometimes laughed, not from joy but disbelief. She asked if Henry would show mercy, but the silence was her answer. Across the courtyard, she could hear the scaffolds being built. She requested a skilled executioner from France, one known for his swift, clean strike. It was granted. Even in her final days, and faced death with grace the court couldn't erase. Before Anne's final morning, the 5 men accused with her were executed. One by one, they climbed the scaffold, silent, resigned, or praying. George Boleyn, her brother, spoke bravely, refusing to confess to crimes he never committed. Their deaths were meant to erase Anne's power, to break her legacy before the final blow. The executions were public, cold, and efficient. But the people watching weren't celebrating. They were uneasy. Even in an age of brutal justice, this felt manufactured. A queen was being unmade, piece by piece, at dawn, and dressed carefully in a dark gray gown with a crimson petticoat. Beneath, a silent symbol of martyrdom. She walked steadily from her chamber to the scaffold, guarded but unchained. A small crowd had gathered, many unsure if they were witnessing justice or tragedy. The French executioner waited, his sword hidden behind a hay bale to spare her fear, and climbed the steps without trembling. There was no priest, no husband, no royal farewell. Just sky above, silence below, and the weight of history on her shoulders, standing on the scaffold, and addressed the crowd, not to beg, not to blame. Her voice was calm. "I am come here to die, according to the law, and thus yield myself humbly to the will of the king." She spoke no anger, offered no accusation. Instead, she prayed for Henry, praised his kindness, and ended with grace. But those watching knew it was the performance expected of her. In truth, her final words were not just for the crowd, they were for history. A message: "You may silence me, but you will not erase me." The executioner, a master of his craft, stepped quietly behind her and knelt, her eyes closed, lips whispering a final prayer. Unlike most executions in England, no axe was used. The French sword was swift, silent, and mercifully sharp. With a single strike, it was over. No scream, no struggle, just the sound of steel through air, and then stillness. The queen who changed a kingdom, who defied a church, who held a crown built on fire, now lay still on a wooden platform, her blood seeping into the straw, Anne's body was left exposed for hours. There was no royal burial prepared, no coffin waiting. Eventually, someone fetched an old arrow chest, meant for storing weapons, and placed her remains inside. Her head and body were wrapped in cloth, then lowered into a shallow grave within the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, inside the tower walls. No ceremony, no procession, no legacy spoken aloud. For a woman who once wore a crown, her end was stripped of everything, except the quiet whispers that followed her into the earth. Before Anne's body was even buried, Henry VIII had moved on. He wore white the day after her death, a color of celebration, not mourning. 10 days later, he married Jane Seymour. The court, once divided by Anne's presence, quickly shifted to favor the new queen. Her portraits were removed, her name whispered less and less, but not forgotten. Some said Henry never spoke of her again. Others claimed he regretted it in his final years. But by then, Anne Boleyn was no longer a queen, just a cautionary tale, and may have been erased from court, but her legacy lived on through her daughter, Elizabeth. Declared illegitimate after Anne's fall, the girl grew up in the shadows of power. Yet the same fire that burned in her mother lived in her too. Sharp wit, fierce independence, and unshakable will. Decades later, Elizabeth would rise to the throne not as a forgotten child, but as one of the greatest monarchs in English history. And in doing so, she restored her mother's honor in a way no monument ever could, and Boleyn was more than a wife lost to betrayal. She was the spark that lit a revolution, the woman who helped reshape the church, who made a king defy the world, and whose daughter would become England's most iconic ruler. Her fall was brutal, swift, and unjust, but her legacy endured. Today, her name is studied, her story remembered, and her voice, though once silenced, echoes through centuries. In a world where queens were meant to obey and dared to rise. And though she died alone, history refused to forget her.